All right, let's jump right into one of the biggest, most mind-bending puzzles in all of Christian theology, the nature of Jesus Christ. For thousands of years, people have been scratching their heads over this, trying to figure out how one person could be described with pairs of attributes that are, well, complete opposites. And that's exactly what this explainer is all about. I mean, really think about it. The central idea here, the incarnation, says that Jesus was both fully God and fully human. But what does that actually mean in practice? How can a single person be all-powerful and at the same time weak? How can they be all-knowing and also somehow ignorant? These aren't small questions. They're the very contradictions that have fueled 2 millennia of debate. And here it is, laid out plain and simple. In one corner, you have the divine attributes, the creator of everything, immortal and unable to die, and so morally perfect that he can't even be tempted. But in the other corner, you've got the human attributes, being a creature, someone who was created, being mortal, someone who actually died, and, as the New Testament tells us, someone who was tempted. So how do you get one person who is all of these things at once?
So what we're going to do is look at one very influential modern attempt to build a logical model for all of this. But we're not stopping there. We're also going to walk through a really detailed critique that argues this model doesn't just fail to solve the original puzzle, it might actually create a whole new set of problems.
Okay, so the solution we're looking at comes from the philosopher William Lane Craig. He calls it a Neo-Apollinarian model, and its big goal is to give us a coherent picture of the incarnation that doesn't fall apart under logical scrutiny. So let's see how he tries to build it. Now, before we get to Craig's idea, you kind of have to see what he's trying to simplify. A lot of the traditional models get really complicated really fast. Some of them break Christ down into 5 different components. You've got the person of Christ, and a separate divine nature, a separate human nature, a rational soul, and a physical body. It gets a bit crowded, you know? So Craig makes 3 big moves to clean this all up. First, he says, let's stick to the classic definition from the Council of Chalcedon. Second, and this is the real game changer, he suggests that the divine nature, often called the Logos, basically is the rational soul of the human Jesus. This means you don't need a separate human soul. And third, to explain how Jesus could live a normal human life, Craig proposes that all the divine stuff, like his omniscience, was basically tucked away in his subconscious. And voila, after those moves, you get a much cleaner model. You can see we've gone from 5 parts down to just 3. You've got Christ, who is the divine nature acting as the soul, the human body, and the complete human nature you get when you put them together. It's definitely a tidier picture. But the real question is, does it actually work? And that brings us to our first major roadblock, laid out by philosopher Dale Tuggy. He argues that even though Craig is trying to stick to the historical script, his model ends up clashing with the very church councils he's trying to honor. So Tuggy points out 3 major conflicts. First, the model seems to imply that the divine Logos was always human, which goes against the creeds that say he became human at a specific point in time. Second, by getting rid of a separate human soul, it contradicts councils that specifically insisted Jesus had one. And third, it suggests Jesus had only one will, a divine one, which flies in the face of the 6th Ecumenical Council, which famously declared that Jesus had 2 wills, one divine and one human. And it's not just about ancient councils. There's a moral problem, too. The New Testament is clear. Jesus was morally perfect. But think about it. If his subconscious knows everything, how could he honestly say things like, I don't know the time of my return? Tuggy's critique is that if he did know on some deeper level, then saying he didn't would be a form of deception. You end up with what some have called a lying Christ. All right, now let's get to the philosophical core of the critique. Remember, the whole reason for building this model was to solve those logical contradictions we started with. But Tuggy's argument is that it pretty much fails to solve any of them. The fundamental problems are all still there. In fact, the analysis identifies at least 11 pairs of contradictory attributes that are still left hanging. That's a whole lot of paradoxes still on the table. So let's just quickly run through a few of the biggest ones. First up, the big one, being uncreated versus being created. A divine being, by definition, has no beginning. But a human being is part of creation. They have a start date. So in Craig's model, if the person of Christ is the divine uncreated Logos, then where's the created part of his humanity? It seems to disappear. Okay, what about knowledge? A divine being knows everything. A human being, not so much. Now, Craig tries to fix this with that subconscious idea, but critics argue that doesn't really work. At the end of the day, the one person, Christ, still knows everything. So he doesn't actually seem to possess the human property of having limited knowledge. And then there's life and death. This one's huge. A divine being is immortal. It cannot die. But the entire Christian story hinges on the fact that Jesus did die. So if the person living the life is the divine immortal Logos, who or what actually died on that cross? The model seems to leave no one who could have. And finally, let's talk temptation. A perfect, all-knowing divine being seems untemptable by definition. Why would you be tempted by something lesser if you're already perfect? Yet, the Bible says Jesus was tempted in every way we are. Again, if the soul of Jesus is the divine Logos, there doesn't seem to be any part of him that's genuinely capable of being tempted. So what's the final verdict from this critique? Well, the ultimate implication is that in the attempt to make Jesus logically coherent, the model ends up hollowing out his humanity, redefining it into something we can barely even recognize. Now, a key defense for this kind of model comes from the philosopher Thomas Morris. He makes this really interesting distinction between being fully human and being merely human. The idea is that merely human means being human with all our normal limitations. The argument goes that Christ is fully human. He has the essential software of humanity, without being merely human, without all the bugs and limitations we have. But Tuggy's response is that this is really just a distraction. It's clever wordplay that avoids the main event. The real issue isn't whether Jesus was merely human. It's the head-on collision between the properties you need to be human and the properties you need to be divine. The core problem is still right there in that overlapping section of two seemingly incompatible ideas. And this brings us right to the heart of the critique, summed up in this one question. If you start stripping away all the essential human limitations, being created, having limited knowledge, being temptable, being mortal, what's really left of being human? The argument is that this model gives us a Christ who only looks human on the outside, a divine being sort of piloting a human body. So, we end right back where we started, with a big question. The New Testament makes this incredible claim that Jesus was like us in all respects, except without sin. But if a model of his nature ends up removing all the fundamental limitations that actually define what it means to be like us, well, in what sense does that claim even hold up? It's a powerful challenge that sits at the very heart of this incredible 2,000-year-old theological puzzle.